Imagine a town where life thrived, where the laughter of children echoed through the streets, and where the spirit of community was stronger than any obstacle. This was Rosewood, Florida, a remarkable black town that stood as a shining example of independence, resilience, and hope in the early 20th century. In Rosewood, families built sturdy homes, children attended schools that nurtured their dreams, and local businesses flourished under the care of hardworking residents. Churches provided not only spiritual guidance but also a center for community gatherings, celebrations, and the exchange of ideas. Every corner of this town told a story of determination, self-reliance, and a deep desire to create a future defined by dignity and opportunity. Unlike many other communities of the time, Rosewood was not shaped by poverty or oppression alone. It was a place where black families could own land, run their businesses, and govern their lives without interference. This independence, however, did not come easily. The residents of Rosewood were determined, educated, and committed to carving out a life that defied the harsh realities of a society dominated by systemic racism and discriminatory laws. Their achievements were a testament to the courage and vision of a community that refused to accept limitations imposed upon them by the outside world. The town's prosperity, however, made it a target. In a period marked by Jim Crow laws and the resurgence of white supremacist groups, the very success of Rosewood challenged the deeply ingrained narrative that black people were inferior or incapable of self-sufficiency. To outsiders steeped in prejudice, Rosewood's thriving schools, businesses, and homes were not signs of achievement, they were threats. And history would soon reveal the terrible consequences of that perception. Before we dive deeper into the events that would forever change Rosewood, it is important to remember the spirit that defined it. These were ordinary people achieving extraordinary things, building a legacy that, for a time, seemed untouchable. Their story is not just a chapter in history, it is a reminder of what can be accomplished when a community comes together, supports one another, refuses to be silenced or erased. If you want to uncover the full story of Rosewood, from its vibrant life to the tragic events that nearly wiped it from history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell so you won't miss any part of this journey into a story that must never be forgotten. The lessons of Rosewood are more than history. They are a call to remember, reflect, and act, ensuring that such voices are never lost again. Stay with us as we explore the rise of Rosewood, the challenges its residents faced, and the incredible courage that shines through even in the darkest moments of its history. By the early 1920s, the promise of freedom for black Americans, so dearly won after generations of slavery, was overshadowed by the harsh realities of systemic oppression and racial terror. The Jim Crow laws, rigidly enforced across the South, dictated nearly every aspect of life, from where people could live and work to which schools their children could attend, creating a world in which black communities were relegated to second-class status. In Florida, as in much of the South, these laws were reinforced by the presence of white supremacist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, whose influence extended into towns, schools, and workplaces, instilling fear and ensuring that black Americans understood the limits imposed on them by society. For the residents of Rosewood, a thriving black town in Levy County, the very existence of their prosperous community stood as a quiet act of defiance in a world determined to deny them equality. And yet, it also placed them squarely in the crosshairs of hostility and jealousy that simmered just beneath the surface of neighboring towns. The town of Rosewood had grown over decades into a place of independence, where families could own land and businesses, educate their children, and support one another without constant interference from white authorities. Its streets were lined with homes built with care, churches where people gathered to pray and celebrate, and shops that offered goods and services crafted by skilled local hands. Every brick, every timbered structure, and every flowered yard told a story of resilience and hope, of a community striving not just to survive, but to flourish in the face of persistent societal barriers. Yet, the prosperity that brought pride to its residents also stirred resentment among those in nearby towns who were steeped in the mindset of racial superiority. For to witness black people achieving success challenged a deeply held narrative, the false belief that black Americans were incapable of self-reliance or leadership. In this charged atmosphere, envy and fear became potent catalysts for violence, waiting only for a spark to ignite a tragedy that would leave scars far beyond the borders of Rosewood. It was in this environment, a volatile mix of opportunity, progress, and looming prejudice, that a single event would unravel the fragile peace that Rosewood's residents had worked so hard to build. The laws and societal norms that should have protected every citizen instead became mechanisms of control, ensuring that black success was never celebrated openly, and that any perceived challenge to the established racial order could provoke swift and brutal retaliation. Residents of surrounding white communities watched with suspicion and sometimes with open hostility, as black families in Rosewood bought property, ran profitable businesses, and invested in their schools and churches. To them, the thriving black community was an affront, a challenge that could not be tolerated in a society structured to privilege whiteness. Even ordinary interactions could carry danger. Black men traveling for work, women walking their children to school, or families conducting business in nearby towns faced the constant anxiety of suspicion. Arbitrary accusations, or the attention of vigilante groups emboldened by the very laws meant to maintain order. The Klan, in particular, leveraged fear and violence as tools of social control, sending messages that defiance would not be tolerated. Cross burnings, threats, and public intimidation were everyday reminders that the residents of black towns, no matter how self-reliant or peaceful, lived under a shadow that could turn lethal in a matter of hours. In Rosewood, this reality was a quiet but constant presence, a tension that shaped daily life, choices, and ambitions, as the people understood that their prosperity, while justly earned, could provoke hatred and danger without warning. The stage was set for disaster when the prejudices, rumors, and unchecked power of the surrounding white population converged. In a climate where the law favored the accuser over the innocent, and where racial stereotypes could transform an unverified claim into a justification for mob violence, any misstep could become catastrophic. Rosewood's thriving independence, its very symbol of hope and achievement, made it a target not for any crime it had committed but for the audacity of its residents to exist, to succeed, and to dream freely in a world that sought to suppress them. It is within this context that the events of January 1923 would unfold, demonstrating how fear, systemic oppression, and violent prejudice could converge to destroy not only property and lives but also the memory of an entire community. Understanding the climate of fear and violence in which Rosewood existed allows us to grasp both the extraordinary courage of its residents and the depth of the tragedy that followed. These men, women, and children pursued lives of dignity and independence, building homes, businesses, and institutions with care, only to live in a world where their very success was perceived as a threat, and where the machinery of law, social expectation, and mob mentality could converge to devastate all that they had worked for. Their story is a testament to resilience in the face of systemic oppression, and it reminds us that progress in a society marked by prejudice is always hard-won, precarious, and deeply vulnerable to the forces of fear, envy, and hatred. Through this lens, the rise and fall of Rosewood is not just a tale of one town's destruction. It is a window into the broader social, political, and racial dynamics of early 20th century America. It highlights the ways in which laws and social structures can be wielded to suppress communities, the dangers of unchecked prejudice, and the extraordinary bravery required to pursue a vision of self-determination in a world determined to deny it. This context sets the stage for the heartbreaking events that would soon consume Rosewood, making the story not only a historical record but also a timeless lesson about the consequences of fear, hatred, and systemic injustice. As the new year dawned in 1923, the residents of Rosewood were unaware that the fragile sense of security they had managed to cultivate in their thriving community was about to be shattered in a single, horrifying moment. For years, they had navigated the complex and oppressive landscape of the Jim Crow South, building homes, schools, churches, and businesses while maintaining a careful balance between asserting their independence and avoiding the scrutiny of hostile neighbors. Yet in the early hours of January 1st, that delicate balance would be irrevocably broken by an event that had nothing to do with their actions or choices, but everything to do with the prejudices and fears that had been simmering around them for decades. In the neighboring town of Sumner, a young white woman named Fannie Taylor emerged from her home in distress, claiming that she had been assaulted by a black man. Her story spread rapidly, fueled by an environment steeped in suspicion, racial stereotypes, and a readiness to believe the worst about black men. In a society where white women were idealized as symbols of purity and innocence, any perceived threat to them was taken as a call to action, often with deadly consequences. Fannie's accusations, though unverified and soon questioned by some who noticed inconsistencies in her account, ignited a chain reaction that no one could contain. Rumors and half-truths traveled faster than the facts, reaching the ears of men in neighboring towns who were all too eager to enforce the deeply ingrained social hierarchies that governed the South. The reaction was immediate and merciless. Fueled by rage, fear, and the lingering influence of white supremacist groups, a mob began to assemble, determined to exact punishment for a crime that had not been proven. The members of this mob were not motivated by justice or the desire to uncover the truth. They were motivated by centuries of ingrained prejudice and a sense of entitlement to control the lives of those they considered inferior. Within hours, they had armed themselves and set their sights on Rosewood, a town that had long been an example of black prosperity and self-determination, a symbol of independence that many in the surrounding white communities viewed as a challenge to the racial order. The arrival of the mob in Rosewood marked the beginning of a nightmare that would engulf the town for days. Doors were broken down, homes were ransacked, and people who had lived their entire lives in peace suddenly found themselves trapped in a landscape transformed by fear and violence. One of the first victims was Sam Carter, a respected blacksmith, whose only crime was existing in a place that now represented a threat in the eyes of the mob. He was seized, accused without evidence, and brutally killed as a warning to others. His death set the tone for what was to follow, a relentless campaign of terror that spared no one, young or old, or female. As the mob spread through the town, flames consumed homes and businesses alike. Churches that had been centers of community life were reduced to ashes, and schools where children had once dreamed of a brighter future were destroyed. Families ran into the surrounding swamps, clinging to each other and praying that the darkness would conceal them from the armed men who pursued them. Every step was a gamble, every sound a potential signal for death, and yet the people of Rosewood persevered, drawing on an inner resilience that refused to surrender, even when the world around them seemed determined to erase their existence entirely. Despite the chaos, acts of courage and humanity emerged amid the horror. John Wright, a white store owner who understood the injustice unfolding, risked his own safety to shelter families, providing food, water, and a temporary refuge from the violence. Others, including a sympathetic train conductor, helped women, children, and the elderly escape, offering a slim but vital chance for survival. These acts highlighted that even in a world marred by hatred, compassion could persist, and courage could flourish in the most unlikely of places. The tragedy of Rosewood was compounded by the silence and complicity of law enforcement and local authorities, who either ignored the atrocities or, in some cases, actively facilitated them. The mob's actions went unpunished, and for decades, the story of Rosewood was buried under a veil of fear and misinformation. Newspapers distorted or omitted the events entirely, leaving survivors to carry the trauma in silence, their memories and voices hidden from public recognition. The false accusation that had ignited the massacre had not only destroyed lives and homes, but had nearly erased the town itself from history, leaving only whispers of what had occurred. The events of January 1923 serve as a stark reminder of how quickly fear and prejudice can escalate into violence, and how vulnerable communities can be when truth is overshadowed by assumption and hatred. The people of Rosewood had done nothing to provoke the attack. Their only crime was existing as a self-sufficient, prosperous black community in a society that could not tolerate their success. This single false accusation became the catalyst for a disaster that demonstrated the deadly intersection of systemic racism, unchecked mob mentality, and the fragility of justice in a society structured to protect the powerful over the innocent. As we reflect on the story of Rosewood, it is impossible not to acknowledge both the horror of the events and the extraordinary resilience of the survivors. Their courage, endurance, and eventual fight for recognition and justice remind us that even in the darkest chapters of history, the human spirit can persist, bear witness, and demand accountability. The tragedy that began with a lie became a powerful lesson about the consequences of prejudice, the importance of truth, and the necessity of remembering history so that such horrors are never repeated. As the sun rose and set over Rosewood, the once thriving town found itself plunged into an unrelenting nightmare, a descent into chaos and destruction that would leave scars not only on the land but on the hearts of those who survived. The initial fury that had brought the mob into the town did not dissipate with the passage of hours. Instead, it intensified, fueled by collective rage, fear, and a deeply ingrained belief that the presence of a prosperous black community was intolerable. Houses that had been built with care, families who had invested generations of labor into their homes, businesses that had supported the local economy, and schools that had nurtured the dreams of children were all seen not as symbols of achievement, but as provocations demanding punishment. The mob, numbering in the hundreds by some accounts, moved with the single-minded determination of a force intent on erasure. Operating under the delusion that violence could restore a social order they felt threatened their supremacy. Sam Carter, the blacksmith whose life had already been taken, became a chilling emblem of the danger faced by anyone in Rosewood, and his murder served as a grim precursor for what awaited the town's residents. Following his death, women and children alike were hunted with ruthless precision. Families were torn from their homes. Some were dragged into the streets, beaten for no crime but existing in a space where their mere presence was interpreted as defiance. Mothers clutched their children and fled into the dense swamplands that surrounded the town, navigating the mud and shadows in a desperate attempt to shield their young from the violence that raged behind them. Yet even in the darkness of the swamps, safety was elusive. The mob pursued relentlessly, firing weapons into the foliage, striking at movement, punishing the innocent for a transgression that had never occurred. The children, too small to comprehend the magnitude of the danger, learned terror firsthand, their innocence shattered in a single night as they witnessed friends and family members fall. Sometimes forever. The flames that consumed Rosewood were more than fire, they were symbols of total destruction. A cleansing by violence meant to obliterate every trace of a community that dared to prosper independently. Homes that had been filled with laughter, meals shared, and quiet evenings became smoldering ruins. Churches, once the beating heart of spiritual life and communal gathering, collapsed under the heat, their pews and pulpits reduced to ash as if to erase the very faith and hope they had cultivated. Schools, repositories of knowledge and promise for the next generation, were gutted by the fire, leaving only charred boards where young minds had once dreamed of a brighter future. The fire's glow illuminated the town in a surreal, hellish light, casting long shadows over families who ran barefoot and bleeding, carrying what little they could salvage while the world they knew disappeared behind them. Amid this orchestrated chaos, acts of courage and human decency emerged like fragile sparks in the darkness. John Wright, a white store owner, understood the injustice being perpetrated and refused to abandon his moral responsibility. He opened his doors to families who had nowhere else to turn, hiding them from the mob and providing sustenance despite the personal danger he faced. Others, including a sympathetic train conductor, extended aid by offering transport to escape, allowing women, children, and the elderly to flee into the safety of distant towns, carrying only the clothes on their backs and the memories of a community that had been reduced to rubble. These moments of bravery were beacons of hope, demonstrating that even in the depths of human cruelty, empathy could prevail and offer a lifeline to those at the mercy of unbridled violence. The complicity and inaction of local authorities exacerbated the tragedy. Law enforcement, charged with protecting citizens, either ignored the unfolding massacre, in some cases, lent tacit approval, allowing the mob to act with impunity. This abandonment highlighted the fragility of justice in a society where systemic racism dictated whose lives mattered and whose did not. The absence of intervention ensured that the mob's destruction was total, and the town's erasure from the landscape mirrored the erasure from public consciousness that would persist for decades. Survivors of Rosewood were left to navigate the aftermath alone, carrying trauma and loss that could not be measured by property or money, as their entire social fabric had been violently torn apart. The violence that swept through Rosewood was not random. It was a meticulously orchestrated campaign of terror, targeting every element of the town's existence. Men were lynched or shot, women faced intimidation and assault, children witnessed unspeakable horrors, and entire blocks were consumed by fire, leaving nothing behind to commemorate their lives or labor. The systematic nature of the attacks reflected a broader societal message. The success and autonomy of black communities would not be tolerated, and the consequences of perceived defiance would be total, unrelenting, and merciless. Over those harrowing days, the town that had once been a model of black achievement and self-determination was transformed into a ghostly landscape of ash and silence, a cautionary emblem of the destructive power of prejudice and unchecked hatred. Even as the immediate violence subsided, the legacy of that week-long assault endured in ways both visible and invisible. Survivors were scattered, families were fractured, and the land that had sustained generations of black residents was abandoned or appropriated by outsiders. The absence of justice compounded the suffering, leaving wounds that could not be healed through time alone. Newspapers either misrepresented the events or ignored them entirely, ensuring that the memory of Rosewood would fade from public knowledge. The horror of the massacre and the totality of the destruction became a story whispered rather than recounted, and for decades, Rosewood existed only in the memories of those who had endured its annihilation. The tragedy of Rosewood illustrates the devastating consequences of racial hatred and unchecked mob violence. The town's erasure from both the physical landscape and public consciousness underscores the importance of remembering and confronting these events, not only to honor the lives lost, but to ensure that such acts of terror are never repeated. The flames that devoured Rosewood were intended to erase a community, yet the memory of its residents, their courage, and their resilience continues to illuminate the enduring struggle for justice, recognition, and remembrance. The story of Rosewood serves as a solemn reminder that the pursuit of truth and the acknowledgement of past wrongs are essential steps in preventing history from repeating its most harrowing chapters. As the fires consumed Rosewood and the sounds of gunfire echoed through the night, the residents faced choices that no human should ever have to make, decisions forced upon them by violence and hatred, where survival meant leaving behind the life they had painstakingly built. Families clutched children to their chests, trembling in the darkness as the heat of nearby flames painted the swamplands in an eerie orange glow, shadows dancing over mud and roots that would become their only refuge. There was no time to collect belongings, no opportunity to salvage memories embedded in furniture, photographs, and cherished possessions. Everything had to be abandoned, left to the inferno that obliterated decades of effort, planning, and hope. Fathers and mothers guided their children through waist-deep water and clinging vegetation, whispering reassurances they did not feel, afraid that a single sound might betray them to the mob hunting relentlessly, intent on vengeance rather than justice. A mob whose numbers grew as word of the alleged crimes spread through neighboring towns, emboldened by the law's complicity and a social order that condoned racial terror. Amid this, the natural landscape of Florida became both a sanctuary and a prison. The swamps, with their tangled roots, muddy banks, and hidden channels, offered cover from bullets and torches. Yet they demanded every ounce of physical and mental strength from those fleeing. Children who had once played in the sunlit streets now struggled to wade silently through murky water, their cries stifled by their parents' hands, the urgency to survive overwhelming the instinct to comfort. Mothers carried infants, their bodies etching under the weight, as fathers guided older children, navigating the treacherous terrain while constantly scanning for the danger that never truly abated. Every splash, every rustle of leaves could be fatal, yet movement was necessary, and the swamp became a labyrinth of fear and resilience, a place where instinct and desperation merged to preserve life even as homes, livelihoods, and the very essence of a thriving community were reduced to ash. For some, the salvation came in the form of rare acts of courage from those outside their immediate community. White neighbors like John Wright, who had witnessed the atrocities firsthand, risked their own lives to offer sanctuary and assistance. His store became a temporary haven, a place where frightened families could rest, eat, and regain the strength to continue their perilous journey. Hidden from the eyes of the mob, these acts of bravery were not widespread but were critical lifelines, instances of humanity piercing the darkness of hate. Later, sympathetic individuals extended aid in more organized ways, such as the train conductor who slowed his train long enough for families to board in silence. Packed together with trembling children and elderly relatives, hearts pounding as the sound of gunshots faded behind them, these fleeting moments of hope contrasted sharply with the devastation they had left behind. Burned homes, destroyed businesses, charred churches, and schools that had once been filled with learning and laughter. The town itself, which had symbolized black self-determination and prosperity, was now a ghostly landscape, its streets empty, the echoes of daily life replaced by the silence of erasure. The psychological impact of these escapes was profound. Families who had fled carried with them not only fear and trauma, but also the realization that their hard work and achievements were instantly rendered meaningless by the violent prejudices of others. Parents worried about how they would rebuild, where they could find shelter, and how they would provide for their children without the support of the community that had nurtured them. Children who had once felt secure now experienced a world defined by vulnerability and loss. The notion of home becoming something that could be obliterated in a matter of hours. Even as they reached relative safety in Gainesville or more distant towns, the memory of Rosewood, the streets, the schools, the churches, and the vibrant life of their community remained vivid. A haunting presence that underscored both what was lost and what they had narrowly escaped. In addition to physical displacement, the survivors endured the burden of social and legal erasure. Law enforcement and local authorities, either complicit or indifferent, offered no intervention, ensuring that the acts of destruction went unpunished. Newspapers, when they bothered to report, either distorted the events or minimized the scale of the tragedy, framing it as a race riot rather than the targeted massacre it truly was. In the aftermath, families found themselves not only without homes but also without recognition. Their suffering rendered invisible to the wider public. The trauma fleeing into the swamps, while saving lives, became inseparable from the grief of witnessing neighbors and loved ones killed or driven from their homes, leaving an indelible mark on the consciousness of a generation forced into survival under conditions of unimaginable terror. Despite the overwhelming adversity, stories of resilience and survival persisted. Families adapted to new towns, forged new connections, and sought ways to rebuild their lives from the fragments of what they had left behind. They carried with them the memory of Rosewood, not as a place of defeat but as a symbol of community, courage, and dignity under assault. Oral histories, whispered between generations, preserved the lessons of that time, ensuring that the legacy of Rosewood and the humanity displayed amid horror would endure even as the physical town ceased to exist. These narratives would later become foundational in the struggle for justice, recognition, and historical preservation, reminding the world that while property and possessions could be destroyed, the strength and spirit of a community could not be fully extinguished. The flight of Rosewood's residents into the swamps and the aid provided by sympathetic neighbors exemplify both the terror of unchecked racial violence and the extraordinary courage of ordinary people. It highlights the precariousness of life under systemic oppression, the fragility of safety when societal structures fail, and the enduring capacity for empathy and solidarity even in the darkest times. These events transformed survival into an act of defiance, leaving behind a lesson as stark as it is essential. The preservation of life and dignity requires both vigilance against injustice and the courage to act with humanity, even when the world seems determined to destroy both. As the last of the smoke from the burning homes of Rosewood drifted into the sky and the echoes of gunfire faded into the dense Florida swamps, a different kind of silence settled over the remnants of the town. A silence that would outlast the physical destruction and linger for decades, muting the stories of the people who had survived the violence and attempting to erase their lives from memory. In the immediate aftermath, the survivors were gripped by a fear so profound that it shaped the course of their existence for generations. Mothers and fathers understood that speaking of the horrors they had witnessed could invite not only social ostracization, but also the potential for renewed violence. And so they buried their memories beneath layers of quiet, whispering only to their children in fragments, urging discretion, instructing them to carry the truth within their hearts but never to speak it aloud. Newspapers, which should have been instruments of accountability and public awareness, became complicit in this erasure, publishing minimal coverage, distorting facts, and in many cases framing the events as a race riot rather than acknowledging the systematic, targeted destruction of a prosperous black community, creating a false equivalence between aggressors and victims that further obscured the truth. Column after column in small, forgettable pages buried the massacre, while those who had orchestrated and participated in the violence faced no legal consequences. Free to continue their lives without remorse, their actions effectively sanctioned by a society structured to value the lives of black citizens so little that justice was not even considered. Maps of Florida, which should have reflected the reality of the towns and communities that thrived across the state, silently conspired with this societal amnesia. Over the years, Rosewood vanished from official records, absorbed into surrounding land holdings and left as overgrown fields and forgotten roads, its name all but erased. A ghost town not only in its physical destruction, but also in the collective consciousness of a nation unwilling to confront the magnitude of the atrocity. Families who survived the escape into swamps and distant towns were scattered, their cohesion dissolved by the need to flee and the absence of any opportunity to reclaim property or livelihoods. The land they had cultivated with pride, the businesses they had painstakingly built, and the schools where their children had laughed and learned were all lost, repurposed or simply left to be reclaimed by nature, while the public remained largely unaware of the town's former existence, as if Rosewood had never been. And the notion that an entire community could be so violently uprooted without consequence became another unspoken truth in the architecture of systemic oppression. Within families, the trauma manifested in myriad ways, shaping relationships, instilling caution, and fostering a quiet resilience born of necessity. Children grew up with fragmented stories, learning of the massacre only through hints and warnings, often feeling the weight of a tragedy they could not fully comprehend, unable to ask questions for fear of stirring old wounds or invoking dangers that had long since faded but were nonetheless omnipresent in their elders' warnings. Each retelling, carefully measured, preserved essential truths while concealing the details that could provoke reprisal, creating a living archive of memory bound by survival rather than formal history, a record that existed in the hearts and minds of those who had endured rather than in textbooks or public discourse. The media's failure to report accurately, the authorities' refusal to intervene, and the societal complicity in ignoring the plight of Rosewood's residents meant that the massacre was largely absent from educational curricula. Public dialogue and collective memory for decades. Scholars, journalists, and historians who later sought to reconstruct the events faced a dearth of documentation, relying heavily on oral histories, fragmented newspaper reports, and the fading recollections of survivors whose courage had allowed them to endure long enough to tell the story. Even when small accounts appeared, they were often buried within local archives or overlooked entirely, leaving a historical void that reflected not only the erasure of a physical community, but also the broader suppression of black voices and experiences across the nation. This decades-long silence also shaped the descendants of Rosewood survivors, who inherited both the trauma of their ancestors and the responsibility of preserving a history that had been systematically denied. The erasure from maps and public consciousness was not merely a geographic or administrative omission. It was a deliberate act that reinforced the societal narrative that the prosperity and self-determination of Black Americans were anomalies to be punished and forgotten rather than achievements to be recognized and celebrated. Generations lived without public acknowledgement that a thriving community had existed, a community that had fostered education, enterprise, and culture, only to be obliterated through violence and left unrecorded, creating a gap in understanding that affected identity, cultural continuity, and the perception of what was possible for Black Americans in the Jim Crow South and beyond. Yet even in this silence, the story of Rosewood persisted, whispered from parent to child, carried in memories, and preserved through the careful attention of those who understood the importance of bearing witness. The town's disappearance from maps and newspapers could not erase the human experiences, the acts of courage, the moments of compassion amid horror, nor the resilience of a community determined to survive even when everything else had been taken. These suppressed narratives laid the groundwork for future generations to demand recognition, justice, and reparations, ensuring that the town would not remain forgotten forever, and establishing Rosewood not only as a cautionary tale of racial violence and systemic failure, but also as a testament to endurance, memory, and the unyielding pursuit of truth despite decades of deliberate erasure. The erasure of Rosewood from public consciousness demonstrates how history can be manipulated, how communities can be rendered invisible through silence and omission, and how the act of remembering becomes an essential form of resistance. It underscores the necessity of documenting, teaching, and acknowledging past injustices, not only to honor those who suffered, but also to prevent repetition of similar atrocities. The absence of Rosewood from maps and media for decades is a stark reminder that survival alone is not sufficient. Recognition, truth, and public memory are critical components of justice, and the courage to confront erased histories is a vital part of ensuring that such tragedies are neither forgotten nor repeated, preserving the dignity and legacy of a community that once dared to thrive against all odds. Decades passed after the ashes of Rosewood settled, and for much of that time, the massacre remained an almost invisible scar on the American landscape, whispered only among survivors and their descendants. Their memories carried quietly like fragile embers, glowing dimly in the dark of collective amnesia, waiting for the moment when the truth could finally be given voice. It was not until the early 1980s that this long-suppressed story began to emerge from the shadows, sparked by the curiosity and determination of journalists who refused to let the past remain buried. Their work a testament to the power of investigative reporting and the moral imperative to shine light on injustices that society had tried to forget. Gary Moore, a journalist with the St. Petersburg Times, became a pivotal figure in this resurgence, driven by a combination of professional rigor and an unshakable sense of responsibility to uncover the truth, to trace the faint traces of a town and a community that had been deliberately erased, and to document the experiences of those who had survived unimaginable terror. Moore began reaching out to the surviving residents of Rosewood, most of whom were now elderly, living in scattered communities far from the ruins of their former home, carrying with them stories that had been locked away for decades, stories of bravery, horror, and loss, stories that could no longer be ignored if the truth of history was to be restored. As Moore conducted interviews, he encountered the painstaking effort it took for survivors to recount events that had haunted them for so long. Many spoke for the first time about the night the mob came, about the homes set ablaze, about friends and family lost, and the terror of fleeing barefoot through swamps in the darkness, uncertain if they would ever see safety again. Their testimonies were harrowing, yet they were also filled with resilience, highlighting not only the tragedy that had befallen them but also their remarkable capacity to endure, to survive, and ultimately to demand recognition after decades of enforced silence. Each story Moore documented added pieces to the puzzle that had long been ignored or distorted by mainstream media, revealing a more accurate and comprehensive narrative that included both the horror of the massacre and the humanity of the community that had been attacked. The publication of Moore's articles created ripples beyond the newsroom, awakening public awareness and providing a platform for survivors and their descendants to begin advocating for formal acknowledgement of the atrocity. For the first time in decades, the story of Rosewood moved from hushed whispers into public discourse, inspiring researchers, historians, and activists to explore the massacre further, and prompting the state of Florida to confront a legacy of racial violence that had previously been swept under the rug. The survivors, now united by the emerging documentation of their experiences, recognized that acknowledgement alone was not enough. They sought justice in a more tangible form, including reparations that could not undo the past, but could serve as a concrete admission of wrongdoing and a measure of restitution for the immense losses suffered. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, these efforts coalesced into a sustained campaign to secure state-level recognition and compensation. Descendants of Rosewood residents, armed with the evidence compiled by journalists and supported by legal advocates, pressed their case before the Florida legislature, presenting personal testimonies, historical documentation, and compelling arguments that emphasized both the moral and legal necessity of acknowledgement. The hearings were emotionally charged, with survivors recounting their lived experiences in detail, describing the loss of property, community, and lives, and making clear that the damage inflicted by the massacre extended far beyond the physical destruction of the town. It had rippled across generations, leaving enduring scars on families, culture, and community cohesion. Legislators were confronted with the undeniable reality that the state had failed in its duty to protect its citizens and had been complicit, through inaction and systemic bias, in allowing a racially motivated atrocity to proceed unchecked, a truth that could no longer be ignored. These efforts culminated in the passage of the Rosewood Compensation Bill in 1994, a landmark decision that represented the first time in American history that a state had formally acknowledged and provided reparations for racial violence committed against its citizens. The bill awarded $2.1 million to the survivors and their families, a sum that, while unable to replace the homes, businesses, and lives lost, served as an official recognition of the wrongs inflicted and a symbolic step toward justice and reconciliation. Beyond the monetary compensation, the legislation carried a deeper significance. It validated the experiences of the survivors, affirmed the existence of the community that had been erased from maps and public memory, and established a precedent for the acknowledgement of racial violence and its enduring impact. The process of passing the bill was not without resistance or controversy, as debates over state responsibility, the sufficiency of reparations, and the interpretation of historical evidence unfolded in public forums. Yet the persistence and courage of the survivors and their descendants ultimately prevailed, demonstrating the power of truth, persistence, and the moral imperative to confront injustice. The Rosewood Compensation Bill also ignited a broader conversation about historical memory, systemic racism, and the necessity of preserving the narratives of communities that have been targeted by violence and oppression. It inspired educational initiatives, historical research, and public memorials, ensuring that the massacre would no longer remain hidden or distorted. Markers and memorials were erected on the land where Rosewood had once stood, providing a tangible reminder of the town's existence and of the lives destroyed. While books, documentaries, and films brought the story to national and international audiences, embedding it into the historical consciousness in ways that earlier generations had been denied. Through these combined efforts, the story of Rosewood transformed from one of silence and erasure into a narrative of recognition, resilience, and historical justice. It highlighted the crucial role that investigative journalism, persistent advocacy, and intergenerational determination play in confronting uncomfortable truths, and it emphasized that while the passage of time may attempt to obscure the past, the deliberate pursuit of truth can restore dignity, honor memory, and provide a foundation for both acknowledgement and accountability. The legacy of the 1994 Rosewood Compensation Bill demonstrates that the acknowledgement of historical injustices, the empowerment of survivors to share their stories, and the provision of reparations can collectively serve as instruments of justice, transforming a once-forgotten tragedy into a source of education, reflection, and collective responsibility, ensuring that the name Rosewood, and the lessons it carries, will never again be forgotten. As the ashes of Rosewood settled and the years rolled on, the town itself vanished from sight. Yet its story endured in the hearts and memories of those who survived and in the faint whispers passed down through generations. Rosewood was more than a location on a map. It was a symbol of Black resilience, independence, and prosperity, a community that dared to dream in the face of oppression, a place where families built homes, schools, and businesses with their own hands, nurturing hope and fostering self-determination. The systematic destruction of Rosewood was not an isolated event, nor was it merely a product of random violence. It was part of a broader pattern of racial terror aimed at erasing Black achievement, suppressing autonomy, and perpetuating inequality. Understanding Rosewood today requires us to recognize the intentionality behind its obliteration and the long-lasting impact of such acts of injustice on both individuals and the wider society. The massacre of Rosewood reminds us that the erasure of Black communities was not only physical, but also historical. For decades, survivors remained silent out of fear. Newspapers misreported or ignored the events, and educational systems largely omitted the story from curricula, allowing a collective amnesia to take hold. In these decades of silence, the wounds inflicted on families and descendants festered quietly, leaving psychological scars that transcended generations. Yet, even in the face of such erasure, the truth could not be fully suppressed. In the 1980s and 1990s, diligent journalists and descendants of survivors began to uncover what had happened, speaking to elderly survivors and piecing together the fragments of memory that had been deliberately buried. Their courage, combined with the persistence of those determined to seek justice, ultimately led to the passage of the Rosewood Compensation Bill in 1994, marking a historic acknowledgement by the state of Florida and providing reparations to survivors and their families. This official recognition served as both a symbolic and practical measure, affirming that the experiences of those who lived through the massacre were real, that their losses were acknowledged, and that the community of Rosewood, though physically destroyed, could never truly be erased from history. But the lessons of Rosewood extend far beyond reparations and official recognition. The town's destruction highlights the dangers of systemic racism, the power of unchecked hatred, and the devastating consequences of allowing societal biases to go unchallenged. It demonstrates the critical importance of preserving history, not only to honor those who suffered, but to ensure that future generations understand the structures of oppression that allowed such atrocities to occur. Remembering Rosewood is a call to vigilance, a reminder that when communities are denied justice and truth is suppressed, the cycles of violence and erasure are allowed to continue. It challenges us to reflect on our own roles in advocating for equity, confronting prejudice, and amplifying marginalized voices that may otherwise be silenced. Rosewood also teaches a profound lesson about resilience and the capacity of human beings to endure even in the most unimaginable circumstances. The survivors who fled into the swamps, who relied on the bravery of sympathetic neighbors, and who later testified before the legislature to reclaim recognition for their community exemplify courage and determination. Their stories underscore that while physical destruction can attempt to erase a community, memory, legacy, and collective truth cannot be so easily extinguished. The revival of Rosewood's story in public consciousness, the subsequent memorials, books, documentaries, and films, all serve as enduring testaments to the idea that while injustice can devastate, truth ultimately rises, and the voices of those wronged cannot be permanently silenced. In remembering Rosewood, we are reminded of the interconnectedness of history and the present. The town's fate resonates with other historical massacres, from Tulsa's Black Wall Street to countless other black communities targeted by racial violence, revealing a systemic pattern of attempts to suppress black prosperity and autonomy. By teaching and learning these histories, we not only honor those who suffered but also cultivate awareness, empathy, and a sense of responsibility to prevent similar atrocities in the future. Knowledge of the past empowers communities, informs public discourse, and strengthens the societal commitment to justice, equity, and the protection of all people, regardless of race or background. Today, as we reflect on the legacy of Rosewood, we understand that the story is not merely one of tragedy but also of resilience, truth, and eventual acknowledgement. The town that was once physically erased now lives on through education, commemoration, and advocacy. Its lessons remind us that history, no matter how painful, must be told, that justice delayed is still justice worth pursuing, and that vigilance and remembrance are essential to building a society where communities can thrive, without fear of violence or erasure. If you have learned something from this story, and want to honor the memory of Rosewood and its residents, please consider subscribing to our channel for more historical stories that illuminate forgotten truths. And like this video to help spread awareness. Sharing these stories ensures that tragedies like Rosewood are never repeated and that future generations understand the importance of justice, courage, and resilience. Together, by remembering and teaching the past, we can help create a world where no community's voice is ever silenced again, and the lessons of history guide us toward a more equitable and compassionate future.